Something I've been working on in my free time is my Moonstone collection. I love the game Moonstone. It is the perfect palette cleanser to my main squeeze 40k. It's a low model count skirmish game. Those models are beautiful and whimsical, and it doesn't use dice. It works very different muscles than 40k. I'm almost done painting up my crew, the denizens of Goblin City. These guys are silly goblins who think of themselves as royalty and noble knights, even though they're just silly little goblins. And my man Ribald the Giant has been holding down the fort with his big ol' cannon. It only hits like 10% of the time, but my opponents can't ignore it because when it does hit, it hits like a cannon. And soon to be painted is my Goblin airship. I'm gonna use this guy as an alternate for Ribald when I don't wanna bring the giant and I wanna get some variety in my games. And speaking of variety in my games, one thing that's gonna be really important is the terrain. When it comes to Moonstone and terrain, I've mostly been mooching off my friends or just quickly throwing something together out of the collection. But what I want is a perfect little skirmish board. I want something cohesive that is fun to play on and modular so that after I finish a game, I can re-rack it and then get another game that feels very different. To pull this off, I have gathered some supplies. I have the terrain in the creeping forest terrain. I've also bought some fabric paints because I've got this old gaming mat that I would not be sad if I ruined it. And I'm not gonna ruin it. I'm gonna make it even better, and hopefully this paint is gonna help. The setting I have in mind for my skirmish board is a mysterious and dangerous forest. So we here at EonsOfBattle have created the Creeping Forest, a set of terrain that turns normal forest things into monsters. The crab trees can scuttle around while granting some cover. The timber mimics are some low walls that can give a nasty bite. Venomous mushrooms can block line of sight, and speaking of blocking line of sight, the land krakens are giants of the forest ready to turn venturers into snacks. This set of terrain was invented by us and is available physically and is STL from EonsOfBattle.com. I can't wait to get gaming with these pieces, but first, it's all gotta get built and painted. The octopus are in two halves, so I glued them together, putting in a little bit of green stuff so I can really squish the two halves together with lots of ultra thick super glue. And this set comes with a bunch of extra branches for adding some more decoration to the trees and critters. Put a little ball of green stuff inside of each tree knot and then shove it in a branch, letting it squish down into the green stuff. This adds a little bit more texture. And speaking of texture, there is a small gap on the krakens. It'd probably be hard to spot after painting, but I want my Moonstone set perfect. I made up a little snake of milliput and then squished this into the gap, using my silicone sculpting brush to shove it into the hole, then squeezing away the excess by rubbing the back of a paintbrush over the putty to knock it off. I want my forest pieces to have an overgrown feel, so I took some Vallejo industrial mud and smeared this in patches over the tree trunks. This texture paste has very fine particulates, so when it's time for painting, these spots will be perfect for moss, and some more special effects. I put the texture paste over my logs, putting a nice stripe over each face. Then it was time to prime, and I hit everything in a black prime. I want my critters very well camouflaged. This might be so magical that they are actually made of wood, so I started out by dry brushing them with some Brigadine Brown, laying this on heavy so it covers 9% of the model, only leaving the primer black in the deepest recesses. Now to start brightening up the saturation, I did another round of dry brushing with Dryad Bark. I did this dry brushing a little lighter than the last layer, putting this on so that some of the previous layers show through. Now to continue brightening up my little crustaceans, I took some desert yellow and I dry brushed this over the top of my logs and all over the crab limbs. Then I mixed in some brain matter beige into my desert yellow and broke out a real paintbrush. I sketched on some lines highlighting the shapes of the wood, keeping my paint watery so it flows nicely onto the mini. This edge highlighting will help show off the texture, but I don't have to be perfect with it. There are a few more layers I'm going to throw over it. The inside of the logs was looking a little dark for my liking, so I sprayed some desert yellow on the inside, then it was time for some inks. Raw sienna and burnt umber. I sprayed on the raw sienna. This is a semi-transparent warm ink that softens and blends the layers it goes over, and I sprayed this around the top of the trees. Then I used burnt umber around the bottom to boost the saturation and further blend my layers together so it looks smooth and natural. With those ink layers on, I did another dry brushing of brain matter beige, hitting the tops of my logs and the insides, and I did some quick swipes over the crabby bits so that there were some crispy edge highlights. Just a few more details now, like the mushrooms growing on the side. I reused my colors, base coating them in desert yellow, then laying down some highlights of a 50-50 mix with the brain matter beige, and then a final highlight of pure brain matter. Even though these are the same colors, focusing on lighter shades makes these details stand out. Now my wood is done, it's time to decorate it with some moss. I painted some green over the texture paste, and this is just a base coat. I have more planned for these spots after a varnish. To finish up my crabs, I need to paint the eyes. I decided I want to continue the warm palette for my little fellas, so I base coated the eyes with an orange. Then I began highlighting the front with some orange mixed with yellow. Once I had the fronts nice and bright, I painted a vertical stripe right up the front, doing 2 little dots of pure white in the corner of each eye to make them look extra shiny. Big bright eyes are probably not great for a creature trying to hide, but maybe they can close these big glowing eyes to make them basically invisible. I hit all my crab trees with a coat of matte varnish, and now to finish up that moss, with one of my favorites, dirted down moss. I poured some of this onto a playing card and then mixed it with a lot of water. I slobbered this over my green, using my finger to flick the paint off the bristles onto the figure so it splattered all over. Then I took the remains and painted this on the top of my log, using some more water to thin it out. Once that was dry, I did a little bit of color shifting to make it even more vibrant. I did a quick dry brushing a leafy green. This caught on all the texture on the paste and made my guys look like perfect little trees, ready to give my guys something to hide behind. I've got my scuttling crab trees all done, perfect for blocking a little bit of movement in the game of Moonstone. And in Moonstone, movement costs a premium. Every time you activate a character, they get 2 to 4 inches of free movement, but then after that, every inch costs energy. Moving is one of the most important things in the game Moonstone, and I intend for these crabs to be moving around too. I got the old Games Workshop scatter die out of the closet, and with this guy, I'm thinking at the top of every turn, you roll for these crab trees, and then wherever they move, they move. If you wanted to go take cover behind a tree, it might just up and walk away. Maybe it'll even push the Moonstones if it happens to run into them as well. I'm very excited to give these moving trees a try, but now it is time to work on the violent trees. The Timber Mimics. This set also has some actual fallen logs, and it's tricky to tell which one is which. I used the same formula I created for my crab trees. They all live in the same forest, so they're probably replicating the same trees. On these pieces, it was even more important to lay down some edge highlights, and I also painted on some extra stripes of Brain Matter Beige to invent more texture than was originally on the models. I want these logs to look as good as my Moonstone minis. I sprayed on my inks doing a stripe of raw sienna over the shaft, and then the burnt umber from below, spraying it from the side so that the texture of the wood protects some of the spots from getting hit, creating a really nice warm looking wood. It's nice and inviting, so adventurers, or Moonstone thieves, don't think twice about getting too close. I painted the mushrooms up with the same colors and then slobbered on my green. And speaking of that green, I painted this over the tongue of the beast. Even though their mouth is open, he's still pretty well camouflaged. I highlighted this by mixing in some of my leafy green, and then for the teeth, I base coated these in Brigandine Brown mixed with Brain Matter Beige. The same colors, but mixed differently, keeps these teeth looking unique while still consistent over the rest of the paint job. After a few layers of highlights, my guy's grin was looking sharp, and after a matte varnish, I took some more Dirty Down Moss and put it on thick over the green. To get Dirty Down Moss to look its best, you have to thin it with a lot of water, about 1 part paint to 4 parts water, and then when you lay it down, you gotta lay it down super thick. Then when it dries, it gets vibrant green in the recesses. And I put on a few swipes of leafy green over top to make the moss look even more intense. There is something nice about a pretty little log. And I think this whole collection could be really fun to play with in game. Even though only one of these is very clearly the Mimic, I do think there's a rule that I could attach to all 4 of these pieces, and that is a hazardous check. If you move within engagement range of any of the logs, you have to take a d6 roll, and if you roll a 1, it turns out that that log was a Mimic and you got bit. And in Moonstone, there is reasons to move into engagement range of these pieces, because if you jump over things, you can get a little bit of extra movement. I've been painting a lot of wood. I think I now know my way around a log. I think it's time to shift to a little something different. What does a giant mushroom look like? I have a ton of these mushrooms to paint, and I want to come up with a process to let me do a good job fast. I started out base coating all the stems with some Tundra Taupe, using the airbrush to dust this on to tint the black primer, and then I did a quick dry brushing of this color to put it on thicker over the details. Then for the classic cap mushrooms, I'm thinking a nice red top. I took some moldy wine, and with the airbrush, I dusted this on the ring around the base and a little puff in the center. Then to bring out the detail without needing a paintbrush, I broke out a makeup sponge. I used this to press on some moldy wine. This hit on the raised detail and missed the recesses. Then I put some orangey red called Resplendent Red over the same spots, letting some of the base layers show through. Then as a final layer of brightness, I did a final layer of lava orange. Each mushroom just got a few dabs of this. The sponge doesn't lay down a full coat on each press, so I can control the brightness, making sure the caps stay red and not orange. I moved on to the spots, base coating them with more Tundra Taupe, and as I was looking over the mushrooms, I think the contrast could be more intense. I paused on the spots to put down some Moody Mauve through the airbrush, spraying this on the low spots to darken them. Then I switched to some Tyrian Navy, using this sparingly over the darkest spots around the ring. Now my mushrooms are looking intense. I continued with the spots. The airbrushing and sponging is so smooth, I don't want to highlight the spots with the brush and have them look too different. Instead, I took a little makeup brush and I used this to stamp on some more Tundra Taupe with some Brain Matter Beige mixed in. Then another little stamp of pure Brain Matter. This kept the spots looking nice and smooth like the rest of the plants. And speaking of the rest of the plants, I want some contrast on the board. For these, I'm thinking orange. I sprayed Burning Ore over the middle of each spiky face and some Barren Dune over the exterior ring. I used the makeup wedge to stamp this color along the edge to make sure it was fully coated. Then, to work with some contrast, I airbrushed some murder scene right in the center and carefully sprayed it in the recesses between each petal. Now my fungi have contrast, I want to lay down some more color. A little maize yellow over the petals and a final dusting of nuclear sunrise. I call this color Gun Orange because of what I typically use it for. This brought back that orangey complexion, and to help me hit on all those little teeth quick, I used the makeup wedge to quickly lay down some brain matter beige using only the brush for the teeth that the sponge couldn't reach. I now have a forest of mushrooms, which is particularly perfect for my little Moonstone crew, the Goblins. I like to bring Shabaroon, the Goblin Wizard. He's not just awesome in the game, but I particularly like him in my crew because of how much I like Ribald and his giant cannon. Now, Ribald's cannon costs 2 energy to shoot, but my strategy is to try to get it to shoot as much as possible, so I use Goblin King to punch Ribald, which does deal him damage, but then it gives him 2 extra energy, so then he can activate and shoot his cannon twice. Shabaroon can then cast Transcombobulate, which lets Ribald activate again with full energy remaining, which is 2, so he can shoot his cannon 3 times a turn. I feel like 3 times a turn, that puts it almost at like 50-50 the cannon actually hits something. Although having all this terrain on the board is probably going to lower my chances of actually having the cannon connect, which maybe is for the best. Now that I'm done with my fungi, I can move on to the land kraken. Not to be confused with the Oklahoma octopus. The story of the Oklahoma octopus is a fun cryptid to look up, and for my octopuses, I'm thinking they can edit their colors to make themselves look like the trees, to camouflage themselves so that adventurers will get a little bit too close. I took my brown recipe and started putting this over my cephalopods, dry brushing all the way up through my desert yellow, and then began sketching on some edge highlights. I didn't hit everywhere, just the most prominent spots, and I didn't hit all those spots. I left some of them to get greened later. After some airbrushing on the limbs, they were looking very branch-like. A perfect mimic for my logs, but for the green, I want to do it a little bit differently. I mixed my green with black to make a darker color, and I dry brushed this over some parts of the tentacles and over their heads. Then I did another dry brushing of pure green. I don't want to use the dirty down because these guys are only faking moss, not actually covered in it. I took some afterglow, and I mixed this with my green to sketch on some edge highlights, painting lines over all the shapes and suckers. Then to tint these spots, I used some neon green ink sprayed through the airbrush over these spots to tint them and blend them together. Then I made up a dark green by mixing Ghillie Dew with Noble Skin together, and I sprayed this on the sides and bottom of the green spots to soften them and make them the same hue as the false wood. I think it's pretty convincing, or a very convincing mimic. The only detail left is the eyes. Like my crabs, I'm thinking warm colors. I put orange over the eyes using some moldy wine as a shadow and afterglow as the highlight. These eyes are huge, so I have plenty of room to do some color transitions. And once I was happy with the funkiness of the eyeballs, I touched up the black primer of the pupil and then gave them an edge highlight. I put a matte varnish over my octopi and then painted on some gloss paint over the eyeballs. It might make more sense for these guys to be fully slimy, but I guess if it is a land kraken, they have evolved to not need the water. I put some gloss varnish over my crab's eyes too, and now the whole ecosystem is ready for action. Imagine you're taking some shelter under a tree, and then that tree starts moving and eats you. Nowhere in this forest is safe, and now that all of the critters are painted, it's time to work on that board. I've got my sacrificial mat, and I have paint specific for this project, fabric paint. Not particularly high quality fabric paint, but I hope it'll get the job done. And to ensure that it gets the job done, I bought regular old, hopefully decent quality white, because white tends to be the deciding factor in a lot of paint jobs. I don't really see why it couldn't be done painting up my own gaming mat, but I've never seen it done, so I'm really excited to run this experiment because if it works, it could be a game changer. Literally, because it's a gaming mat. I laid out my victim. This is my first gaming mat and it's been through a lot. 2 flooded basements, a bunch of moves, and I actually cut this 3x3 chunk out of a full 4x8 40k mat. It had started to rot, so I cut off the ends. I still have them though. If this works out, maybe I can use some more of the leftover chunks to turn them into something else. This mat is a classic green grass, but it's not particularly exciting. The details are very subtle. I want the details to pop. So I cracked open my fabric paints and I grabbed my real paintbrushes, the big boys. I started loading up a cardboard palette with some color to start trying them out. I don't know what to expect, but here goes. I mixed a little brown with black and started painting this on. It does not go very far. The paint really soaks into the fabric, so I had to lay down a lot of paint to get some coverage. It seems to stick though, so it's time to start figuring this out. I took some green paint and started stamping this on. The green didn't want to cover very good, so I mixed it with some white paint, which really helped to actually show up over the dark brown. I think the white is going to be essential for getting the paint to look vibrant. I mixed it into the brown and painted a stripe running between my grass sections. And while it was still wet, I mixed in some pure brown in between the path and the trees. It started to look like something. I put some yellow and orange down onto the brown to see what it did to the colors. It does add a little variety and brings back a little saturation. I tried actually painting on some stuff, and boy does the green not cover. I mixed it with a little yellow and white, and I found painting some black underneath helps to outline these little leaves from the surrounding brown. Everything is still wet right now, so I can blend in my colors, laying down some more yellow and light brown, and then using a bigger brush to stamp the pigment into the previous layers, creating a forking path between my trees. I took a black paint and started laying down some shapes. I want to paint on some rocks and broken wood, so these spots will get covered in more paint, and that little bit of black showing through will just be the shadow. I started filling in the logs, and seeing how bright the details are looking, I need to bump up the path too, stamping down some more light browns in between my bits. The paint lays down pretty vibrantly, but dulls a lot while it dries, so I had to keep putting down more layers to bump up the saturation. I laid down dots and spots of my lighter colors, which broke up the ground, and eventually I was happy with my terrain. Now for the green. The green is darkened a lot while it dries, so I used a smaller paintbrush to lay down some little swipes as leaves sticking out over the path. Then I began stamping down some more green over these spots. Seems like the paint lays better on over more paint because the colors don't seem to fade as much. It actually seems to be working. The paint is very flexible. I mean, it's super fresh right now, so maybe as it ages, it'll start to firm up, but so far so good. It seems like this is a proper matte. I can fold it all the way in half and it doesn't seem to damage the paint. So I think this is gonna work. The paint itself just seems like normal, low quality paint, which is fine. I can make that work, and I am excited to see what this is actually gonna end up looking like. I think the cardboard was absorbing some moisture out of my paint, so I switched to the top of my wet palette and started laying down some more paint, basically putting this everywhere. I can't salvage anything from the mat underneath. I think I'll continue the paths between leafy sections, so I kept laying down some more and more paint, letting the paths evolve. It took a lot of paint to lay down the base layer, and I'm starting to get a little nervous I won't have enough. 2 ounces of each color don't go as far as I thought. Now that I have the experience of my little section, I can replicate it a little quicker, and the paint stays wet for a while, so I can paint on huge sections and still have time to stamp and blend my layers together. It's kinda wild how much the color fades as it dries. I had to put down many layers to get my paint to look good. And speaking of looking good, I really like how the wooden planks are looking, so I decided with this big section to paint it on like it's an old bridge that has seen better days. I black primed my details and then slowly worked them up with some more browns and tans. Having to paint every single millimeter of this mat, it's dawning on me how big this project is going to be. But carefully setting my terrain down on the not quite dry paint, it does look really good. Having painted the left side of the mat, the right side is dried out, so I brushed some more watery brown over these sections to rehydrate the paint so I can continue my wet blending and stamping. It's really neat painting like this. I now own a ton of gaming mats, but this one is truly mine. And it's turning out so good, I kinda wish I wasn't painting over an old rotten mat. But I suppose if this project was crashing and burning, I'd be thrilled it was on a garbage mat. I now have 50% of the mat painted. It was a little disheartening to see how much new space there was to get painted, but I'm ready for it. I just don't know if I'll have the paint to do it. Laying down big sections of paint, it goes quick. I almost needed to load more paint onto my palette for every brush stroke. I'm also really fighting against how much the paint fades. I was probably too gentle with the white paint. I could have laid down almost white tan and it would have faded to a brownish, but instead I found myself going over each section again and again and again, trying to get my colors to show up. I also should have bought a big tube of black paint. This little 2 ounce is getting down to the dregs. Eventually, I was able to get these sections looking like the other half of the mat, and I'm working in big sections this time, so everything is taking longer to dry. It is very interesting doing some good old-fashioned 2D painting. This is basically just a giant freehand. I'm probably spending a little bit too much time with the Rosemary & Co. Synthetic Series 201 size 6. This is a tiny little brush in comparison to this giant board, but I want it to look nice. And speaking of looking nice, this paint is weird. It's very, very gel-like, and so when I'm painting, I'm used to paint flowing into the tip and then off of the tip onto whatever I'm painting. But with this stuff, since it's like a gel, it's a paste, I really quickly use up whatever is on my tip and then I have to really quickly go back and refresh my paint. It's a little exhausting, it's a little time consuming, but I am having a lot of fun. However, I did super underestimate how much paint I'm gonna need. I am almost out of brown, almost out of black, almost out of green, really hoping that I have enough green to actually get this done. I'm used to 2 drops of paint going all day with mini painting, but on top of this fabric, it really soaks up the paint, and so like 1 brush full of paint basically just does 1 stroke on the kind of canvas. I am going to need this little 2 ounce bottle of green to do a lot of work, but you know what? I bet there's just about enough, or at least enough left. I primed my little leaves, intersecting with the brown in my pads, ringing all the unpainted gaming mat. I'll still have to lay down some paint to prime these spots, and because I was running so low on paint, I started mixing in a bunch of yellow and orange paint just to get something down. I need the paint to go far. After I had some color down in these sections, I started stamping with my pure green on top, and a little bit of green mixed with white. Then a little bit more yellow and orange just to try to fill them all in. It just about worked. I managed to get everything colored. Well, I am now out of paint, but I was able to get the green parts green and the brown parts brown. I'd like to get some more paint and touch it up a little bit, but it is more than good enough to get gaming on. And speaking of painting on this stuff, the paint went on very inconsistently, and I had the best results when I was putting paint over many layers of paint. And I think that makes a lot of sense because I think canvas painters, they prime their canvases, and that probably helps to let the paint flow on a little bit more consistently. Also, I don't know what the paint is doing to the neoprene underneath the fabric. This mat is probably close to 10 years old. It's seen some winters, and that neoprene is starting to dry out and crumble, and so we'll see what happens. I super want to see what it all looks like covered in terrain, but right now it is soaking wet, so I'm gonna let it sit overnight, and then I get to see what it looks like. It's all dry, and so far so good. It's holding up. I rolled it up, I moved it over here, I unrolled it, and it survived that. So far, it seems like it's gonna work really nicely, and it was really interesting to do. Now that the terrain is on there, everything on this board was painted by me, including the literal board, and it all works so well together. It's whimsical, it's a little creepy, it's a little slimy, it's full of gobos. This is the board I was after. Painting up a gaming mat was a really enjoyable experiment, and if I was to do it again, number one, I would buy much better quality paint and a lot of it, because it turns out it takes a ton of paint. But now that this worked out, I got some ideas for some other war games that I would love to make some custom battle mats for. But right now, I want to get some reps of Moonstone in with the creeping forest. Look at all of these little spooky trees, little crab trees. All of this terrain was invented by us and is available physically and digitally from EonsOfBattle.com. My little gobos are gonna get bitten by a log. If any of you guys have experience with fabric paint, please leave your suggestions in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.